Alright, so this is just a review for Exam 4. So remember that Exam 4 is going to have the same format as Exams 1 through 3. It'll be multiple choice, true, false, and matching. The difference will be that it will be password protected, so students will need to set up an appointment to take this with a proctor. I know that most of you have done this, but please, if you have not done this, do this as soon as possible, and let me know if you have any questions about that. So Exam 4 is going to cover Skinner. It's going to cover Bandura, and then also our last lecture on implications for assessment and therapy. So kind of briefly going back through the highlights here, we said that Skinner would be considered a behaviorist, although there were other behaviorists that came before him. So the general idea behind behaviorism is that we can, based on research on people's behaviors, we can predict behavior, we can manipulate behavior and try to control for behavior. The basic idea behind behaviorism, for the most part, is that yes, there may be other things going on, thoughts, feelings, but because we can't really study those scientifically, then they're not really relevant to us. Rather, we're going to focus more on specific behaviors. So, although we should, with good research, be able to predict and manipulate behavior, that doesn't necessarily mean we will always understand why people do what we do. We'll just understand whether they're going to do that or not. So behaviorism is really built on two types of conditioning, classical and operant conditioning. So classical conditioning is the idea of learning associations. So an unconditioned stimulus will produce an unconditioned response naturally. This is something that we're basically born with. It's part of human nature. So, for example, if an individual is hungry, they see food and it smells good, then the response to that is salivating, drooling. That's a natural thing. When you smell something that smells really good, your mouth waters. Nobody taught that. Your mouth just waters naturally whenever you smell something that smells delicious to you. So, the basic idea is that we have some stimuli that produce a response in us naturally. The unconditioned part tells us that this is natural, there was no learning involved. However, there are some associations that we have only because we've learned these associations. And this would be a conditioned stimulus that produces a conditioned response. Now, remember that a conditioned stimulus is something that was originally neutral. Originally, the conditioned stimulus did not cause any kind of response. But over time, if an unconditioned stimulus and a conditioned stimulus are paired together over and over and over again, then over time, it will become a conditioned stimulus. It was previously neutral, but now it's conditioned. Now I've learned to respond to it. And now the conditioned stimulus will produce the conditioned response. Now, the unconditioned response and the conditioned response are typically the same response. It's just a difference of whether it happens naturally or whether it happens because of something we taught you. So the classic example here when we're talking about classical conditioning is Pavlov and his dogs. So Pavlov discovered that dogs, when presented with dog food, salivate. The unconditioned stimulus of the food causes the unconditioned response of the dog salivating or drooling. This was natural, this was normal, and nobody taught them this. Also, before conditioning, a bell sound is neutral to the dogs. There's no reason for the dogs to associate a bell with food initially, but over time what they would do is they would bring the food to the dog and they would ring the bell, give the food, ring the bell, give the food. Over time, the dogs learned the association between the conditioned stimulus of the bell that was previously neutral but is now a conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus of the food. Basically, the dog says, hey, I'm noticing that every time that bell rings, I get food. The bell must be connected with the food. What happens then is that the dog has learned a new association. The bell that was neutral is now a conditioned stimulus that will cause the conditioned response of drooling. Now, notice that drooling in response to the dog food is an unconditioned response. But drooling in response to the bell is a conditioned response. So we had to learn to drool to the bell. We did not have to learn to drool to the dog food. Okay, so what does this have to do with people? We're obviously giving an example about animals here. Well, the same thing could be true for people, right? So an example here, if being with your boyfriend or girlfriend or partner is an unconditioned stimulus that naturally makes you feel happy. That's an unconditioned response. But what happens over time is that sometimes your significant other will start wearing a certain kind of perfume or cologne or shampoo or whatever. And now that smell was originally neutral, but now you have smelled the smell and seen your partner, smelled the smell and seen your partner. So over time, you've learned the association. Now it's no longer neutral. Now it's a conditioned stimulus that can cause the conditioned response of feeling happy. We had to teach you to be happy in response to the smell. We didn't have to teach you to be happy in response to your partner. Okay, that's a very brief overview, but if you have any questions, let me know. The other type of conditioning that we talked about primarily here was operant conditioning. So the basic idea behind operant conditioning is that a behavior that is reinforced will be more likely to occur again. A behavior that is punished will be less likely to occur again. You're also going to see the positive and negative terms here. Positive means we're adding something, negative means we're taking something away. So a positive reinforcement means I'm adding something to increase the likelihood of a behavior happening. So if I give my son a piece of candy every time he shares with my daughter, that will make him more likely to share again in the future. If I give college students extra credit points for coming to class, that will make them more likely to come to class. So what we're seeing here is I'm giving you something desirable that will make you more likely to do a certain behavior. Negative reinforcement is also going to increase the likelihood that a behavior occurs because it is reinforcement. The difference here is that it's negative. Negative reinforcement means I am taking away something from you that you do not want. This will also increase the likelihood of a behavior. So if I have a headache and I take Tylenol and the Tylenol makes my headache go away, I've been reinforced for taking Tylenol. I'll be more likely to take Tylenol in the future. Not because the Tylenol gave me something desirable, but rather because it took away something I did not want. Other examples of this, sometimes a person has anxiety, so they avoid the situations that make them anxious. So maybe, for example, a person is afraid of public speaking, so they avoid public speaking. Well, that's negatively reinforcing. Every time you find a way to avoid it, you have that anxiety removed, and having something you don't like removed makes you more likely to do it again in the future. This can also be how phobias can be maintained, but that's another class for another day. Positive punishment is adding something undesirable to decrease the behavior. So, for example, pain, shame, guilt, extra chores, extra homework, anything like that. So if you've ever had a teacher give you extra homework for talking in class, or if you ever had to clean the chalkboards or scrape the gum out from under the bottom of the desks at school, that's positive punishment. It means we're adding something undesirable to decrease the behavior. And then the last one is negative punishment. It's punishment, so it's also intended to decrease the behavior. The negative part says that we're taking something away. So this is the idea of taking away something positive to try to decrease the behavior. So if, for example, a parent puts a child in timeout, timeout means we're taking away your attention, we're taking away access to entertainment, access to toys, books, other things. So we're basically taking everything away from this person. Also, if you've ever gotten a parking ticket or a speeding ticket, they're taking your money. Having someone take your money is negative punishment. They are taking away something you like, which is your money, to try to decrease a behavior such as driving too fast, that kind of thing. Okay, so if you have any questions about that, let me know. You have to understand this bit to understand the rest of this. So briefly, when we talked about reinforcers as being something that makes a behavior more likely to occur, there are some reinforcers that are always reinforcing from the very beginning, and that would be an unconditioned reinforcer. So like, for example, food, comfort, like babies like food, babies like comfort, sleep, I'm convinced becomes more important the older that you get, becomes more reinforcing, but that's unconditioned. Nobody taught you to enjoy sleep or to enjoy food. However, a conditioned reinforcer is something you also enjoy, and maybe it will also increase the behavior, but only because you learned it was valuable. The classic example of this would be money. So money in and of itself is not worth anything. Money is only valuable because you can exchange it for other things that you like. So basically what has happened is you were conditioned to like money because you were able to exchange it for things that you wanted. So you had to learn the value behind money, but no one had to teach you the value behind food. Right? Okay. Shaping is the idea that we reinforce baby steps that look closer and closer to our final goal. So for example, if I'm trying to teach my son how to read, I'm not going to say, okay, you have to read this whole long book before you get the first reinforcer. That's not going to work. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set a lot of really small goals along the way. And every time he reaches a goal, he gets a reinforcer for that. Now, once he knows his ABCs, then there's no reason to keep giving him a reinforcer for doing his ABCs anymore, though. When you reach one milestone and you go up to the next one, we stop reinforcing the first milestone. Now you have to, for example, sound out words, that kind of thing. So we're going to continue to reinforce behaviors that look closer and closer like our final goal behavior of being able to read an entire book, right? Schedules of reinforcement, basically the idea that if we want to reinforce a good behavior, we want to increase it, then we have to figure out how often we're going to provide reinforcement. So continuous reinforcement would mean reinforcing the behavior every single time that it happens. That's fairly rare. There are a few examples though. If you turn on a light switch at your house, the light comes on, right, every time, unless the power is out. So I don't know if any of you have ever experienced this, but because we have been so reinforced by this, the power could be out at your house for 3 days and you'll still turn on the light switch when you walk into a room, just because it's such a reinforced behavior. So that would be an example of a pretty much continuous reinforcement. I could theoretically follow my kids around and give them an M&M every time they do something desirable. The problem with that is that I want them to do the behavior even if they don't get a reward every time. Plus, at a certain point, they'll get tired of M&Ms, like if that's even possible. So what we're going to do is we're going to have schedules of reinforcement, a plan basically of when we're going to reinforce the behavior. So, for example, we can have a fixed ratio schedule where you have to do a certain number of behaviors before you get the reward, and you know how many behaviors you have to do. This is like saying, I'll give my son a piece of candy every time he does 4 math problems, or I'll give my college students extra points every time they come to class 3 times in a row, something like that. That is a fixed ratio schedule because it's based on your behavior and you know how many times you have to do it in order to get the reward. Variable ratio is also based on your behavior, but because it's variable, you don't know how many times you're going to have to do the behavior before you get the reward. So think about putting a coin in the slot machine, for example. You don't know how many coins you have to put in. I mean, you know that if you don't do the behavior, you don't put a coin in, you won't win any money. But you don't know how many times you're going to have to put the coin in before you do win money, if you do at all. Other examples of this, I don't know if you've ever taken part in research and had to call participants to try to get them to sign up for research studies. But there are days when you'll call 20 people and you'll get 20 no's, or 20 people in a row that don't answer the phone. So you don't know how many times you're going to have to dial a number before somebody agrees to be part of your study. But that's reinforcing as well. So ratio schedules are based on your behavior. Interval schedules are based on time. So a fixed interval schedule suggests that the individual knows the certain amount of time that's going to have to pass before they can get the reinforcement for the behavior. Okay? So, like, for example, if you know that your favorite television show is going to come on at 8 o'clock tonight, you have to do the behavior of turning on the television in order to get the reinforcer of watching the show. If you don't turn on the television, you won't get that reinforcer. But you have to wait a certain amount of time before that behavior can be reinforced. And you know how many hours it is between now and your favorite television show. Another example of this could be if the teacher tells you they're going to post their grades at a certain time, then you checking your grades all day long does not actually speed up the teacher posting the grades. You know how long you have to wait, and so you get that grade. A variable interval schedule basically says we know that we're going to have to wait some amount of time before we get the reinforcer, but we don't know how long we're going to have to wait. So this would be like if you didn't know when the teacher was going to post the grade. So this would be checking the grade every 2 minutes to see if it's posted because you don't know when it's going to be posted. Okay? So you have to wait a certain amount of time, but you don't know how long that time is going to be. So maybe you don't have a TV guide, if they even have TV guides anymore. I'm dating myself a little bit here, but anyway, maybe you don't know what time the show is coming on, so you keep checking the television to see if it's on because you don't want to miss it. I mean, that's variable interval. You don't know how long you're going to have to wait. Okay? Briefly, extinction is the idea that conditioning is not permanent. It can be undone. So we have extinction of classical conditioning. We also have extinction of operant conditioning. So in classical conditioning, if the conditioned stimulus is never paired with the unconditioned stimulus again, it will stop producing the conditioned response. So follow me here. If I taught the dog that the bell, which is the conditioned stimulus, goes with the food, which is the unconditioned stimulus. Now I ring the bell and the dog salivates, but I don't present the food. The dog will continue to salivate for a while because when I'll ring the bell, they'll be expecting the food. But after enough time passes, if I keep ringing the bell, but I no longer bring food, the dog will learn, hey, the bell does not signify food anymore. That association is no longer valid. Extinction is also possible in operant conditioning. So if you've been reinforcing college students for coming to class and then you stop giving that reinforcer, they might keep coming to class for a certain period of time, but after a while they'll stop coming to class. On the other hand, if you've been punishing a bad behavior and then you stop giving the punishment, the bad behavior will come back. So what would happen if they stopped giving out parking tickets? Or what would happen if they stopped giving out speeding tickets? Probably the environment would be a little less safe, I would think. But interesting, definitely interesting. So extinction is the idea that conditioning is not permanent. All right, I spent a lot of time on that, but I wanted to make sure that that makes sense. I didn't know if you had behaviorism in any other classes. So Bandura suggested that there is a social cognitive theory here that we do learn from observing other people, but it's not just straight observation. It's not that we just straight model people. We also pay attention. We choose our models carefully. So maybe, for example, we model people that we look up to, people that we respect, people of high status. So we're not likely to model someone who is younger than us or less successful than us, perhaps, but we choose successful models. And maybe we don't do their behavior exactly the same. Maybe we tweak it a little bit, but we do learn by observing. The idea of inactive learning is that we add in our own cognition. We add in our own thinking styles to the behaviors that we're modeling. So once again, we're not perfectly copying, just following the general guidelines of what other people are doing. Now, when we talked about our reciprocal determinism here, this is the idea that there are three characteristics that all work together to determine when we will model and how we will model. So one of the aspects here was behavior. So maybe your history of behavior, what you've done in the past, how past behaviors have worked out for you. Also, you have your own personal style, so your own personality and your way of thinking play a role. And then the third thing here was the environment. So do you have people that support you? Do you have people reinforcing you? That kind of thing. So that will all play a role in whether we end up modeling and how successful we are in our modeling. Human agency was kind of Bandura's idea. This is kind of the essence of humanness to Bandura, the ability for us to plan ahead. So when we talked about the features of human agency, basically we said that we can intentionally choose the behaviors we want to do. We can think ahead and plan for those behaviors, and we can also react to that. So if we notice that something we're doing is not working out well, we can adjust it. If our goals need to be changed, we can do that as well. So we're not just straight copying other people. We have our own goals that we're trying to achieve, and observational learning and modeling is one of the ways we might meet those goals. Now, self-efficacy is basically the concept of whether we actually think we can be successful or not. So if I see an individual do a behavior and they're very reinforced for it, but I don't think I can do it, then I'm not likely to try. Even though I see that person that I look up to doing this and they're being reinforced for it, if I think, okay, but regardless, there's no way I could do that, I'm not likely to try. So self-efficacy is basically when we compare ourselves to other people. If we're high in self-efficacy, we have confidence that we can follow through similarly to other people. If we have low self-efficacy, we don't feel confident in that ability. So carrying on with the idea of efficacy, collective efficacy is the idea that I can't do this alone, but I could do this if I had a group of people working with me. So sometimes we have, like, for example, like a volunteering effort. Like I can't build this house for this individual by myself. I can't feed all of these people by myself, but I can if other people will pitch in and help me. So collective efficacy is believing that a group of people can accomplish something. So I skipped over proxy agency here. Proxy agency is the idea that there are just some things realistically in our environment that we have to depend on other people to do for us. we can't do everything for ourselves. So although we have self-efficacy in a lot of areas, there are some areas we don't. So if my house is on fire, I'm going to try to get out of the house. I'm going to call 911. I'm going to call the fire department. I'm going to let them take care of it, right? Because I don't feel confident in my ability to fight a fire, okay? I can't talk the fire down like a therapist wants to. Anyway, the idea is that if, for example, if I'm sick or if one of my children is sick, I'm probably going to go call a doctor because I don't feel confident in my ability to achieve my desired goal here. So proxy agency says that we still have to work together, and sometimes we have to reach out for help. Self-regulation is basically just the idea that we can control our own behaviors. Now, that sounds relatively straightforward, and many of you might agree with this, but remember that there are some of the therapists and the theorists that we talked about this semester that would not agree with this ability to freely choose your own behavior. Now, Bandura suggested that most of our dysfunctional behavior is the result of modeling individuals who have similar dysfunctional behaviors. So, for example, we talked about aggression here. We talked about how Bandura did his Bobo study doll, where he had some children watch an adult be aggressive with the Bobo doll. Other children did not see the adult being aggressive, and they found that the children who had seen the adult being aggressive were much more likely to play in an aggressive way with the doll. The idea that if an adult does it, and someone that they think is an individual who knows more or an individual in authority, then they're much more likely to be aggressive themselves. So Bandura would suggest that the majority of our dysfunctional behavior is just modeling other individuals' dysfunctional behavior. So then, if we're going to try to change that behavior, we need to try to find models who are demonstrating functional behavior. So if a child has only ever been around angry, aggressive people, we need to find calm people who work through problems in another way for that child to model off of, and then reinforce the child when they model the more positive role models. Okay? All right, and then briefly, assessment and therapy. We talked about how an assessment is basically something we use to gather information to help us make a decision. So when we talked about assessment, we said that we had to understand where assessments come from and whether or not they're high quality. So we said that an observed score is equal to the true score plus the error score. This is basically the idea that every time we have a test, you have the score that you made on the test. That's the observed score. Now, the score that you made on the test or the measure is made up of the true score and the error score. So you have a certain level of intelligence that is truly yours. You have a certain level of knowledge in a certain area that is truly yours. You have a certain type of personality that is truly yours. The reason why the true score does not automatically equal what the test finds is that there's always going to be some level of error. So if we want our measures to be reliable, we need to try to reduce or, if possible, get rid of that error altogether so that our observed score could equal the true score. So we talked about types of reliability and validity. I won't go through all of that again. You have that in the lecture video. But basically, reliability is the idea that our tests are consistent and free from error. So we said that if you give the same test multiple times, you should find a similar result. If you give multiple versions of the same test, you should find a similar result. If we have multiple people watching a situation, they should find a similar result. You're going to see that reliability is consistency. Validity refers to being able to accurately measure what you're supposed to measure, not measure something different. So we talked about aspects of validity that we need to make sure we're measuring all of the important factors in a concept. So like, for example, if we're measuring personality, I need to have questions that cover all of the different areas of personality, for example. We also said that we need to make sure that our scores make sense based on comparing our measure with a different measure that's measuring the same thing, or comparing our measure with a future outcome, for example. And we also talked about making sure that our measure is actually measuring what it's supposed to be measuring and not something like reading ability or the ability to guess or test-taking ability, that kind of thing. Now, we said that it is possible to have a measure that is reliable without being valid. So once again, this is the idea that if I step on my scale and it says that I weigh 1,000 pounds, it might tell me that over and over and over again. So it's reliable, it's consistent, but it's not valid because it's not accurately measuring what it's supposed to be measuring. So a measure needs to be reliable to be valid, at least if we're talking about a fairly consistent thing like personality or intelligence, that kind of thing. But Does a measure need to be valid in order to be reliable? So when we're talking about this, it does really depend on what you're talking about. So we said that there is a time, perhaps, when something that we're measuring is not reliable but could still be valid. Like, for example, if we were measuring mood. So mood is something that changes daily, hourly sometimes. And so if I gave you a measure of mood on one day and you were sad, and I gave you the measure again later and you were happy, that doesn't mean that my measure is not valid just because it's not reliable, because mood is something that fluctuates all the time. So giving that little caveat here, typically it has to be reliable in order to be valid. But just because it is reliable doesn't mean that it's valid. You can be reliably wrong. Okay? And let me know if you have any questions about any of this. So when we talked about personality tests, we said that there are projective tests that are less standardized. So even though they are a standardized set of items for you to look at, the way that they are scored is not as consistent as something like a structured personality test. So projective tests, I gave you an example of a Rorschach, which was the ink blots, and the TAT, the thematic apperception test. This is the idea, and it's going to be used more by a psychodynamic, psychoanalytic individual. The idea that we have unconscious conflicts that we're not aware of. So if I were to ask you a straightforward question, you wouldn't know the answer. You wouldn't be able to give me a truthful answer. But if I were to give you something very ambiguous, like some ink blots or a random picture, and ask you to tell me a story, eventually what your internal conflicts are going on, that will eventually come out, right? We also talked about how they use free association, that kind of thing, or you just start talking and eventually whatever it is that's bothering you will come out. So projective testing are primarily used by psychodynamic or psychoanalytic individuals, although there are sometimes when you might use that even if that's not your orientation. So perhaps if you're just looking to get some information about an individual, maybe you give them the test just to see if they have interesting answers, not necessarily to score it, just to use it qualitatively to get some information. A structured test is one that is very standardized, set of questions that's going to be measured in the same way. It's going to be scored in the same way, administered in the same way. And we talked about the MMPI and the PAI. Both of these are used frequently. The MMPI had just true-false questions. The PAI had questions that were like false, slightly true, mainly true, or very true. So it gave you a little bit more wiggle room as far as not having to say something is entirely true. So the MMPI is an older measure. It's been around longer. We said that there were advantages to it, that it, just like the PAI, they both have validity scales to make sure that a person is not lying. It's still possible to fake these tests, but it's very difficult to do so. We said that the MMPI is very long. Of course, the PAI is long as well, but it's not as long as the MMPI. There are some things that the PAI measures that the MMPI does not, but they're both pretty good structured personality assessments. And then finally, therapeutic orientation. So some of the theorists we talked about this semester would fall into the psychodynamic category, where they believe that psychological issues come from internal conflicts. And so they're going to use things like projective testing, free association, dream interpretation, all of that to try to be able to interpret the unconscious conflicts that an individual has. Practically, we said that that will probably be a long-term therapy, takes a long time, maybe difficult to find a psychodynamic therapist, not as supported by a lot of the research. Humanistic therapeutic orientation is basically Carl Rogers, like client-centered therapy, the idea that individuals are essentially good, so something is getting in the way of them being kind of self-actualized or being the best version of themselves, and so we have to try to figure out what that is. A lot of that would involve, in a humanistic perspective, giving those conditions for growth, being genuine, having unconditional positive regard, showing empathy. And then you would also want to help the client to identify his or her like current self, like who you are now, who you want to be, and then try to set reasonable goals to work towards. The humanistic therapist is not going to be directive, so it's intended for the client to kind of lead the process. The client is assumed to be the expert in their own experience, and so it might be that this appeals more to some people than others, depending on your style. Behavioral therapy would kind of be built on the ideas of Skinner and others. Basically, the idea that sometimes we have been punished for good behavior. It happens. Or maybe we've just not been reinforced for good behavior. Or maybe we've been reinforced for bad behavior or just not punished for bad behavior. And so we might have some patterns of behavior here that are not healthy, that are not beneficial to us. So it would be very specific. We would have homework. You would have goals to meet. It would focus on the current and possibly the future, but there would be very little focus on the past that you would see more in something like psychodynamic therapy. So it's very practical, straightforward, a lot of homework, but very much supported by research in treating certain anxiety disorders and even depression as well. And then cognitive therapy, primarily the research has looked into cognitive therapy for depression. It seems as though it would be effective for some anxiety disorders and maybe other disorders as well. Cognitive therapy basically says that the problems that an individual have is because of the way that he or she interprets things that happen to them or the kinds of thoughts that they have. So sometimes individuals maybe feel like something that happened was their fault, or they felt like they should have been able to prevent something, or they have a very negative way of thinking, and so you can see how that could then lead to symptoms of depression. So a cognitive therapist is going to try to help the individual identify those thoughts that are inaccurate or just not helpful and model some more accurate or more helpful thought patterns for them. Now, cognitive therapy and behavioral therapy are very often combined, so you might see cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT. There are versions of CBT for the majority of psychological conditions that are fairly effective. Alright, so this has just been a quick review of the study guide for Exam 4. Remember that Exam 4 is the proctored exam, so make sure you have an appointment to take that with a proctor. After Exam 4 is closed, I'll post everyone's grade in the class before the final exam, and if you are happy with that grade, you are done. You don't need to do the final exam. If you would like to potentially improve that grade, though, the final exam is there for you to help, so I'm going to automatically drop your lowest exam grade. So if your final exam ends up being your lowest exam grade, it will just be dropped, so it won't hurt you. But if your final exam grade is higher than one of your exams throughout the semester, then it will replace that one and add points to your points total. So let me know if you have any questions as you prepare for Exam 4, or if you have any questions about the way that I calculate grades. It's been a wonderful semester. I have enjoyed getting to know you guys, and I hope that I have the opportunity to teach you all again.